Welcome to the tutorial on using the Pivot Tables template. I'm going to show you how the Pivot Tables template sheet works in the Fast Excel development template. Now, this is not a tutorial on pivot tables, and you need to know the basics on what pivot tables are and how they work. If you need background on the principle of pivot tables, then we have e-learning modules on this in our Fast Excel e-learning section. The Fast Excel development template provides a simple extension of the basic pivot tables functionality in Excel. It adds dynamic named ranges and paste down functions that we saw in the other template sheets. Before we go into the development template, let's look at the traditional way to create pivot tables. Here we have a table of data that represents total demand. The standard way to create a pivot table would be to select a cell here, insert pivot tables, and it would create a static range for the source data table. Excel recognizes the table headings, and we use them to build the pivot table. This summary view is not very helpful if we have to use the data table for further calculations. It has a mix of item codes and dates in the same column. Often, it's more helpful to convert this to classical view using the menu here. Also, we don't need the subtotals, so they can be turned off too. Now let's see what happens when we import more data. The order book has some new records. When we update the sheet, the formulas will paste down to the bottom of the data because they are dynamic. The demand sheet has recognized the new records and will explode them. The demand table is now a new size. If we look back at the pivot table and refresh, the records are not included. This is because the pivot table is fixed against a static range. So obviously this method is not going to work in developing these planning systems. Let's go back to a pivot template and look at an alternative. Let's copy the pivot table template and rename it Demand Summary. The pivot table template looks very similar to a normal pivot table that has already been created. The first step is to go to the source data and change it to one of the table names that we have already created. Hit F3 and that gives us a list of all of the names, and we can build it against this demand table. We build the pivot table in exactly the same way as you would do normally. When you use pivot tables to process data, you'll more than likely want to perform calculations along the side of the pivot table. One of the simple things we may need is to have the row values repeated in every cell rather than these blank cells in column A. This simple formula is a way that we can get normal data tables from pivot table rows. Run the create names macro and update to paste the formula results as values down to every row of the table. As with the query sheet, formulas go in row 8 and headings in row 10. If you need to add pivot table columns, then you'll first need to insert blank columns here. Anytime you insert more fields into the pivot table and change its shape, you'll need to run the create names macro again to update the names. The pivot template has some simple presets built into it to make it easier and quicker to build pivot tables for production scheduling systems. It brings all of the dynamic named ranges for paste-down operations and enables you to use pivot tables that are used in the development process.